Hello everyone, welcome back to Insomnia Protocol. Tonight, we have another terrifying horror story for you. Before we start, please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave a comment below. Now, get ready, and let's dive in. My name is Caleb and I work as a claims adjuster for a small insurance office outside Missoula, Montana, the kind of job where you spend most of your day driving to inspect fender benders and water-damaged basements, and I had been saving up for 2 years to buy a used truck that did not smell like cigarettes. So when my friend Danny texted me about a cabin his uncle left him in his will, I said yes before he even finished explaining where it was. Danny and I had been friends since high school, back when we used to skip gym class to play cards in the parking lot. And even though we had drifted into different lives, him managing a hardware store, and me stuck behind a desk filling out damage reports, we still made time once a year to do something stupid together, usually camping trips that ended with one of us getting poison ivy in a place we would rather not talk about. This time felt different from the start, because Danny called me instead of texting, and his voice had this strange flatness to it that I had never heard from him before. Even when his dad passed away 3 years ago. He told me his uncle Walt had died alone in a cabin up near the Bitterroot Mountains, and that nobody in the family had spoken to Walt in almost a decade, not because of some dramatic falling out, but because Walt had just slowly stopped answering calls, stopped coming to holidays, stopped existing in any way that mattered to the rest of them, until a county sheriff found him and called Danny as the listed next of kin. Danny said the cabin was his now, along with about 11 acres of land, and that he needed to drive up there to sort through Walt's belongings before the estate lawyer finalized everything. And he asked if I would come with him for the weekend, partly for company and partly because he did not want to be the only person standing in a dead man's house. I agreed without really thinking about it, because that is what you do for a friend. And because honestly the idea of getting out of the city for a couple days sounded better than another weekend of laundry and grocery shopping. We left on a Friday afternoon, driving Danny's old Bronco up through winding mountain roads that got narrower and rougher the further we went, until the pavement gave way to gravel and the gravel gave way to packed dirt lined with pine trees, so tall they blotted out most of the sky. Danny was quiet for most of the drive, which was unusual for him, since he was normally the type to fill silence with bad jokes or complaints about his ex-girlfriend. But that day he just kept glancing at his phone, checking a folder of scanned documents the lawyer had sent him. About 20 minutes before we reached the cabin, he finally spoke, and what he said made me laugh at first, because I thought he was joking. He told me that along with the deed and the will, there was a handwritten letter from Walt, sealed and addressed to whoever inherited the property, and that the letter contained something he called house rules, written in Walt's shaky handwriting, warning that the cabin should never be entered after midnight, not for any reason, not even to grab something forgotten outside. I asked him if his uncle had dementia near the end, thinking that was the obvious explanation, and Danny said the sheriff mentioned Walt seemed sharp as a tack right up until his heart gave out. No diagnosis, no confusion, nothing that would explain writing something like that. We pulled up to the cabin just as the sun was dipping behind the ridgeline, and it looked exactly like what you would picture: dark wood siding weathered gray by decades of mountain winters, a sagging front porch with a rusted oil lantern hanging from a hook near the door, and a stretch of dead grass leading down toward a tree line, so thick you could not see more than a few feet in. There was something about the place that made the hair on my arm stand up before we even got out of the truck, though I chalked it up to the cold, and the fact that we were miles from any other sign of civilization. No neighbors, no cell service, just us and a whole lot of pine trees. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and old firewood, and everything looked frozen in time. Dishes still stacked in the drying rack, a half-finished crossword puzzle sitting on a side table, a wall calendar still turned to a month from over a year ago. Danny found the letter exactly where the lawyer said it would be, tucked inside a metal lockbox under Walt's bed, and he read it out loud to me while we sat at the kitchen table, with the last bit of daylight fading through the windows. The letter was short, only a page and a half, but every line felt heavier than the last, describing 6 specific things that had to be followed without exception once the sun went down. Things involving the porch lantern, the fireplace, the hallway leading to the attic, the bedroom window, the bathroom mirror, and the front door at dawn. Danny laughed nervously after he finished reading, saying his uncle must have written it as some kind of twisted prank, maybe even a way of keeping people away from the cabin, so nobody would sell it after he died, and I wanted to agree with him. I really did, because that explanation made a lot more sense than the alternative. But even as he said it, neither of us moved to open a window, and neither of us suggested going outside to check the lantern that was already burning low on the porch, flickering weakly against the growing dark beyond the tree line. It was almost 11 at night by the time we decided to actually settle in, unpacking sleeping bags in the living room, since neither of us wanted to sleep in Walt's old bedroom. And that was when Danny looked at his watch, then looked at me, and said maybe we should just follow the rules for tonight, just to be safe, just until morning. And I remember laughing and telling him that was the most ridiculous thing I had ever heard him say. I did not know yet how wrong I was to laugh, because somewhere out past the dead grass and the tree line, something was already waiting for midnight, and it had been waiting a very long time. Danny did not push the subject after I laughed at him, but I noticed he kept the letter folded on the table next to him instead of putting it back in the lockbox, like some part of him wanted it within reach. We spent the next hour going through boxes in the living room, mostly old photographs and receipts, trying to distract ourselves from the fact that the cabin had no working television and no cell signal, just the sound of wind pushing through the pines outside and the occasional creak of old wood settling under its own weight. Around 11:30, I got up to use the bathroom down the hall, and it was only when I passed the kitchen window that I noticed the lantern on the porch was still lit, its small orange flame trembling behind the glass, casting long shadows across the dead grass. I mentioned it to Danny when I came back, half joking, asking him if his dead uncle had rigged the thing to some kind of battery so it would never actually need refilling. And Danny just shrugged and said the lawyer mentioned Walt bought oil in bulk from a supply store 2 towns over, like that explained why a flame would still be burning steady after who knows how many hours. We decided to try to sleep a little before midnight, laying out our sleeping bags on opposite ends of the living room rug, and for a while it actually felt normal, just 2 guys catching up in low voices about work and family, and nothing in particular, the kind of conversation that makes you forget where you are for a few minutes. I must have drifted off around midnight, because the next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of wind hitting the cabin harder than before, a low howling that rattled the window frames, and when I opened my eyes the room was darker than it should have been. I sat up and looked toward the kitchen window, and my stomach dropped when I saw that the porch lantern was no longer glowing, just a black shape hanging from its hook, no flame, no light, nothing. I shook Danny awake and pointed toward the window, and for a second neither of us said anything, both of us just staring at the space where the light used to be, and I could hear his breathing pick up beside me. He grabbed his phone to check the time, and the screen read 12:47, well before the 3 o'clock mark from the letter, and I remember him saying out loud, in a voice that did not sound like him, that we still had time, that maybe it was not too late to fix it. I told him it was just wind, that the flame probably got blown out because we left a window cracked somewhere, and I offered to go check, thinking it would be an easy thing to prove there was nothing to be afraid of. Danny grabbed my arm before I made it to the door, gripping harder than I expected, and told me the letter said never step outside with a match to relight it in the dark, that whatever was under the trees was waiting for exactly this kind of moment. I pulled my arm free, more annoyed than scared at that point, telling him his uncle was clearly not right in the head near the end, and that a house does not come with monsters just because an old man wrote a letter. But even as I said it, I found myself standing a good 3 feet back from the front door instead of reaching for the handle. We argued in whispers for almost 10 minutes, Danny insisting we wait it out until morning, without going near the door. Me pointing out that if the lantern stayed unlit until 3, we would be sitting in the dark with no idea what was actually happening outside. In the end, we compromised, agreeing to watch the porch through the window instead of opening the door, taking turns so neither of us fell back asleep and missed whatever might happen. It was during my turn, somewhere close to 1 a.m, that I noticed the fireplace behind us had started to shift color, the normal orange and yellow flames bending into something closer to blue, then deepening into a strange shade of turquoise that did not belong in any fire I had ever seen. I called Danny over, and we both stood there staring at it, neither of us saying a word, until I heard something underneath the crackling of the logs, a low sound that took me a second to recognize as a voice, faint and rasping, repeating my name over and over like it was testing how the syllables felt. Danny grabbed my shoulder and pulled me back a step, telling me not to look directly into it, that this had to be the second thing from the letter, the fireplace rule about never staring into the center of the flames for more than 10 seconds once the whispering started. I wanted to argue again, to tell him this was insane, that fires do not talk and lanterns do not just extinguish themselves out of nowhere. But the voice inside the fireplace said my name a third time, clearer than before, in a tone that sounded almost pleased with itself, and every argument I had ready died somewhere in my throat. We backed away from the fireplace and sat pressed against the far wall of the living room, as far from both the window and the hearth as the small cabin would allow, watching the strange blue light flicker against the ceiling, while the wind outside grew louder. And somewhere past that wind I thought I heard something moving through the dead grass toward the porch, slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. Danny checked his phone again, and the time read 1:17 in the morning, which meant we still had almost 2 hours before the lantern deadline. 2 hours of sitting in a cabin with a fire that knew my name and a light outside that had gone dark for reasons neither of us could explain. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I started to understand that whatever Walt had written in that letter, he had not been exaggerating, and he had not been losing his mind either. We sat against that wall for what felt like an hour, watching the turquoise light in the fireplace slowly fade back to normal orange, the whispering voice trailing off into silence, somewhere around 1:30. Though neither of us moved right away, both of us half expecting it to start again the moment we relaxed. Danny kept checking his phone every few minutes, not for any reason except to watch the clock creep closer to 3, and I noticed his hands were shaking slightly every time he lit up the screen, which was strange for a guy who used to talk his way out of speeding tickets without breaking a sweat. Around 2 in the morning, I brought up the obvious problem again, the one neither of us wanted to say out loud, which was that the lantern outside was still dark, and the letter was very specific about relighting it before 3, not just leaving it unlit until morning. Danny pulled the letter out again and read the first rule over twice, his voice barely above a whisper, and we both noticed the same detail this time, that it did not say the lantern had to stay lit forever, only that if it went out, we were not supposed to go outside with a match to relight it in the dark. That left us with a question neither of us could answer, whether the rule meant we had to find some other way to get it lit again, or whether we were simply supposed to accept the darkness and wait for whatever came with it. Danny suggested we look for a spare lantern or a flashlight strong enough to check things from inside, and we spent the next 20 minutes digging through drawers and closets, moving as quietly as we could. both of us aware of how loud our own footsteps sounded against the old floorboards. We found an old battery-powered lamp in a hallway closet, dusty but still working when Danny flicked the switch, and we set it on the kitchen table facing the window, hoping the extra light might do something to keep whatever was out there at bay. Even though neither of us really believed that logic held up, it was somewhere around this search that I first noticed the hallway leading toward the attic stairs, a narrow strip of darkness at the far end of the cabin that the battery lamp barely reached, and something about staring down that hallway made my chest feel tight in a way I could not explain. Danny noticed me looking and told me, in a voice that had gone completely flat again, that the letter mentioned something about that hallway too. Something about checking the attic windows at 2 a.m, and when he checked his phone, the time read 1:58. I told him we were not doing that no rule on earth was going to convince me to walk down a dark hallway toward an attic in the middle of the night just because a letter told us to. But Danny reminded me that Walt's letter was not really giving instructions to do something, it was warning us about something that was going to happen whether we wanted it to or not. Almost as if the cabin itself had been listening, I heard it then, a soft creak coming from somewhere near the attic stairs, followed by another, evenly spaced, like the sound of weight shifting from one step to the next, and both of us froze at the same time. Danny grabbed the battery lamp off the table and pointed it down the hallway, the beam catching nothing but empty space and a thin layer of dust hanging in the air. But the creaking continued, slow and steady, moving closer to where the hallway opened into the living room. I whispered to Danny that maybe it was just the old wood settling from the temperature dropping outside, the same explanation I had given for the lantern. But even as the words left my mouth, I did not believe them, and judging by his face, neither did he. The letter had said something about a cold breath against the back of your neck and about a second set of footsteps pacing close behind, and I remember feeling an urge to look over my shoulder, even though I was standing perfectly still in the middle of the living room, nowhere near that hallway at all. Danny must have felt something similar because he grabbed my sleeve and pulled me further from the hallway entrance, back toward the kitchen table where the letter still sat, and we watched together as the beam of the lamp trembled slightly in his hand, not from a draft, but from him barely managing to keep his grip steady. The footsteps stopped just short of where the hallway met the living room, and for a long moment there was nothing but silence, the kind that presses against your ears and makes you painfully aware of your own heartbeat. And then, quietly, almost gently, something exhaled, a slow breath that seemed to come from directly behind both of us, despite the fact that we were standing against the far wall with nothing but empty space at our backs. Neither of us turned around, both of us remembering the third rule from the letter without needing to say it out loud, the one about never looking back, no matter what you feel or hear, and I focused every bit of willpower I had on staring straight ahead at the kitchen table, counting the seconds in my head until the feeling of cold breath against my neck finally faded. When Danny checked his phone again, the screen read 2:11, and the lantern outside was still dark. The battery lamp on the table was flickering weaker than before despite being nearly full when we found it. And somewhere behind us in the hallway, the attic stairs let out one final creak, as if something had decided to retreat back up into the dark rather than come any closer. I finally let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, and Danny turned to me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, not fear exactly, but something closer to grim understanding, like he had just accepted that this weekend was never going to be about sorting through his uncle's belongings, and that we still had almost an hour left before the lantern deadline, an hour that suddenly felt impossibly long with the bedroom window rule, and everything else still waiting somewhere ahead of us in the dark. Neither of us wanted to stay in the living room after what happened near the hallway, so we moved into the small bedroom at the front of the cabin. the one with a single window facing the porch, figuring it would let us keep an eye on the dark lantern without standing directly in front of the main window, where anything outside could see us just as clearly. The bedroom still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, and there was a narrow bed pushed against the wall with a quilt that looked handmade, along with a small dresser and a nightstand holding a framed photograph of a younger Walt standing in front of the same cabin, smiling in a way that felt strange to look at now, knowing what we knew. Danny sat on the edge of the bed with the letter in his lap, rereading it under the glow of the battery lamp, and I stood near the window, watching the black shape of the unlit lantern through the glass, waiting for something, anything, to change. It was almost 2:30 when Danny read the fourth rule out loud again, the one about the bedroom window, saying that soft tapping would come against the glass, and that 3 short knocks meant nothing more than tree branches brushing the pane, but 4 rapid knocks with the sound of fingernails meant we needed to shut the curtains immediately and cover our ears until morning. I told him there were no trees close enough to this window to explain any tapping at all, since the porch overhang blocked most of the branches from reaching this side of the cabin, and Danny just looked at me without saying anything, which was somehow worse than if he had argued back. We did not have to wait long, because at exactly 2:30 by his phone, a soft sound came against the glass behind me, light and almost delicate, like a fingertip tapping in a slow rhythm, and I counted without meaning to 1, 2, 3, and then it stopped. Danny let out a breath and said that was fine, that was the safe pattern, and for a moment, I actually felt something like relief loosen the tight knot that had been sitting in my chest since the lantern went dark. That relief lasted only a few seconds, because the tapping started again almost immediately, faster this time, and I counted 4 distinct knocks before a 5th one landed harder than the rest, accompanied by a thin scraping sound that reminded me of nails dragging slowly across glass. Danny was off the bed and pulling the curtains shut before I even fully processed what was happening, his movements sharp and practiced despite the fact that none of this should have felt practiced to either of us, and I grabbed the edge of the fabric to help him get it closed all the way, blocking out any view of the window completely. The scratching against the glass grew more insistent once the curtains were shut, no longer polite little taps, but something closer to frantic clawing, like whatever was outside had realized it lost sight of us and did not appreciate the sudden barrier between itself and the room. Danny pressed his palms against his ears, exactly like the letter instructed, and after a second of hesitation I did the same, sitting down hard on the floor with my back against the dresser, trying to block out a sound that seemed to be getting inside my head, no matter how hard I pressed. Even through my hands I could hear pieces of it, a voice layered somewhere underneath the scratching. Not quite words, more like fragments of sentences spoken backward, rising and falling in pitch, and every so often I thought I heard my own name mixed into the noise, the same way it had come from inside the fireplace less than 2 hours earlier. I do not know how long we sat like that, both of us on the floor with our ears covered and our eyes shut, but at some point the scratching slowed, then stopped entirely, replaced by a silence so complete it felt almost louder than the noise had been, and neither of us moved for what felt like several minutes after that, afraid that lowering our hands too soon might invite it back. When Danny finally checked his phone, the screen read 2:53, which meant the lantern deadline was only 7 minutes away, and something about seeing that number made both of us scramble to our feet at the same time, remembering all at once that we had a decision to make about the porch light that we had been putting off for nearly 2 hours. We stood at the bedroom door, neither of us reaching for the handle, both of us thinking through the same impossible math, that stepping outside with a match after the flame had gone out was explicitly forbidden. But the letter never said what would happen if 3 o'clock arrived and the lantern was still dark. Whether that meant we had simply run out the clock safely, or whether something worse was going to happen the moment the deadline passed. Danny suggested we watch from the kitchen window instead of the bedroom, since it gave a clearer view of the porch. And I agreed, mostly because staying in one place any longer felt unbearable after what had just happened against the glass behind me. We crept back down the short hallway to the kitchen, both of us glancing instinctively toward the darker hallway leading to the attic stairs, relieved to see it empty and quiet. And we took up positions on either side of the kitchen window, watching the black shape of the lantern hanging perfectly still against the porch post. At 2:59, the wind outside picked up again, rattling the trees along the tree line, and I found myself holding my breath without meaning to, watching the second hand on Danny's phone crawl toward the top of the hour, both of us silently praying that whatever came at 3 o'clock would be something we could survive without breaking any more rules than we already had. The second hand hit 3 o'clock, and for a moment absolutely nothing happened. No sound, no movement. Just the two of us standing frozen at the kitchen window, staring at a lantern that remained exactly as dark as it had been for the last 2 hours. And I actually let out a short laugh, the kind that comes from relief more than humor, thinking maybe we had made it through the worst part. Danny did not laugh with me, and when I glanced over at him, his eyes were fixed on something past the porch, somewhere near the edge of the tree line, where the dead grass met the darker shapes of the pines. And when I followed his gaze, I saw it too, a faint orange glow flickering low to the ground, moving slowly between the trees like someone was carrying a small torch through the woods. At first I thought it might be a hiker or a ranger, someone with an actual flashlight or lantern of their own. But the glow moved wrong, drifting sideways instead of forward, sometimes rising several feet off the ground before dipping back down, never once revealing the shape of a person carrying it. Danny whispered that this had to be connected to our lantern somehow, that maybe whatever put the flame out had taken it, was carrying it through the trees like some kind of trophy, and I did not have a better explanation to offer, so I just nodded and kept watching, my hands pressed flat against the cold window glass. The light drifted for almost 5 full minutes, weaving between trunks, occasionally disappearing behind thicker clusters of pine, before reappearing somewhere else entirely, and then, all at once, it simply stopped, hovering in place at the very edge of the clearing, close enough that we could make out individual blades of dead grass illuminated in its orange glow. For a long moment it stayed perfectly still, and I had the distinct impression that whatever held that light was looking directly at the cabin, studying the windows, maybe deciding whether we had broken any of the rules laid out in Walt's letter. Then, without any warning, the light shot forward across the clearing at a speed that did not match anything natural, closing the distance to the porch in under 2 seconds, and both Danny and I stumbled backward from the window at the same time, nearly knocking over a chair in our scramble to get away from the glass. I braced for the sound of something hitting the porch, footsteps, a crash, anything, but instead there was only silence, followed a moment later by the faint smell of burning oil drifting in through the cracks around the window frame. And when I finally worked up the nerve to look again, the lantern hanging on its hook was lit, burning steady with a small orange flame exactly as it had been when we first arrived. Neither of us said anything for a while after that, both of us just staring at the relit lantern, trying to decide whether this counted as a good sign or something far worse, and Danny eventually broke the silence by saying quietly that maybe the rule was never really about keeping the lantern lit ourselves, maybe it was about proving to whatever lived out there that we understood the difference between waiting and interfering. We sat at the kitchen table after that, both of us too wired to think about sleeping, and it was almost 4 in the morning when Danny mentioned he needed to use the bathroom. Standing up and stretching like his body had finally remembered it was still a normal human body with normal human needs despite everything that had happened over the last several hours. I reminded him about the 5th rule, the one about the bathroom door needing to stay bolted shut from the outside after midnight, and about never turning on the hot water or looking into the mirror if he was forced to go inside, and Danny nodded, already walking down the short hallway toward the bathroom door at the far end. The door was closed but not bolted, exactly as we left it hours earlier before either of us had thought to check, and Danny hesitated with his hand on the handle, glancing back at me like he wanted permission or reassurance, neither of which I felt qualified to give him at that point. He went in anyway, since there was no version of this trip where either of us was willing to walk outside to relieve ourselves given everything happening beyond the tree line. And I stood just outside the door, listening to the sound of the faucet running. Cold water only, exactly as instructed, and I found myself staring at the thin strip of light beneath the door instead of anything else. It was maybe 30 seconds later that the water shut off, and I heard Danny go completely still on the other side of the door. No movement, no sound at all, and I asked quietly if he was okay, my voice sounding too loud in the narrow hallway. He did not answer right away, and when he finally spoke, his voice came out strange and distant, saying that the mirror in front of him was fogged up despite the water being cold the entire time, and that something was moving behind the fog, slow and deliberate, like a hand dragging across glass from the inside. I told him to get out, to leave the bathroom immediately without looking any closer, and I heard him fumble with the door handle. And when he finally stepped out into the hallway, his face had gone pale in a way I had never seen on him before, his eyes wide and unfocused like he was still seeing something that was not actually there anymore. We bolted the bathroom door shut together, sliding the small metal latch into place with hands that were both shaking at this point, and Danny told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that just before he pulled away from the mirror, he thought he saw his own reflection raise a hand toward the fog glass, even though his own hands had been braced firmly against the sink the entire time. We ended up back in the living room after the bathroom, both of us needing distance from that hallway, more than either of us wanted to admit out loud. And for the first time since midnight, the cabin actually felt quiet in a way that did not immediately put me on edge. Danny sat with his back against the couch, knees pulled up, staring at nothing in particular, and I noticed his hands had finally stopped shaking, though he kept flexing his fingers every so often like he was still trying to convince himself they belonged to him. I asked him if he wanted to talk about what he saw in the mirror, mostly because the silence was starting to feel heavier than the noise had been, and he shook his head at first, then changed his mind and said it was not so much what he saw as the feeling that came with it, like the reflection had been waiting behind that fog for a very long time, patient in a way nothing living should be able to manage. We had almost 2 hours before the 6th rule would come into play, the one about checking the shadow at the door come 6 in the morning, and neither of us wanted to spend that time sitting in silence imagining what might come next, so Danny suggested we go through some of Walt's boxes again, if only to have something to focus on besides the clock. We found a shoebox tucked under the side table that we had missed earlier, filled with old photographs and a stack of letters tied together with twine, and Danny untied the bundle carefully, spreading a handful of them across the coffee table between us. Most of the letters were mundane, correspondence between Walt and someone named Rosalind, a woman whose name I did not recognize from anything Danny had mentioned about his family, and the earliest letters read like nothing more than a normal friendship, talking about weather and small-town gossip and plans to visit each other come summer. The tone shifted about a third of the way through the stack, Rosalind's handwriting growing tighter and more frantic, mentioning something she called the arrangement, and warning Walt in increasingly urgent language that once you accepted a cabin like this one, you could never truly leave it behind, that the land remembered who lived there and expected certain things in return for letting you stay. Danny went pale reading one particular letter, and when he handed it to me, I understood why. Because Rosalind had written, in shaky handwriting near the bottom of the page, that the rules were not there to keep you safe from the cabin. They were there to keep the cabin satisfied enough that it would not come looking for you on nights when you broke none of them at all. I asked Danny if he thought that meant we were in danger, even if we followed every single rule perfectly. And he did not answer right away, just kept staring at the letter like it might rearrange itself into something less frightening if he looked at it long enough. We kept reading, and near the bottom of the stack, we found a final letter. This one much shorter than the rest, written by Walt himself instead of Rosalind, dated only a few months before he stopped contacting the rest of the family entirely, saying simply that Rosalind had gone up to the cabin alone one weekend against his advice, and that she had not come back down, and that the sheriff's search of the property had turned up nothing except her car parked at the bottom of the trail. Neither of us said anything for a long moment after reading that, and I found myself glancing toward the front door, despite the fact that dawn was still well over an hour away, thinking about the sixth rule, about a shadow with no head standing on the porch, pretending to be someone you trusted. Danny gathered the letters back into a neat stack and set them aside, saying quietly that this explained why Walt cut himself off from everyone. That losing someone to whatever lived on this land probably made him decide it was safer to be alone than to risk anyone else ending up like Rosalind. And something about the way he said it made me realize he was thinking about his own place in all of this, wondering if inheriting the cabin had somehow inherited the same arrangement Rosalind mentioned. We spent the next stretch of time mostly in silence, checking the windows every so often, watching the lantern continue to burn steady on the porch. And around 5:30, Danny finally asked the question neither of us had said out loud yet, whether we should even open the door at 6 if someone knocked, rules or no rules. Given everything we now knew about how this land treated the people who trusted it. I told him I did not have an answer, that the letter seemed to assume we would open the door eventually, that checking the shadow was meant to be a warning system, rather than a way to avoid answering entirely, and Danny nodded slowly, though I could tell the idea of opening that door in half an hour was sitting just as uneasily with him as it was with me. By the time the sky outside the curtains began shifting from black to the faintest hint of gray, both of us had positioned ourselves near the front window again, watching the tree line for any sign of movement, both of us keenly aware that whatever answered a knock at 6 in the morning might not be something either of us wanted to see clearly. At exactly 6 in the morning, 3 knocks landed against the front door, slow and deliberate, and immediately after them I heard a voice call out from the porch, muffled through the wood, calling Danny's name in a tone that sounded almost exactly like his cousin Mike, the same cousin who lived nearly 4 hours away and had no reason to be anywhere near this cabin. Danny went rigid beside me, and I could see the confusion flash across his face before it settled into something closer to dread, because whatever logical part of his brain wanted to believe his cousin had somehow tracked us down, another part of him clearly remembered the 6th rule well, enough to hold himself back from reaching for the handle. The voice called out again, asking us to open up, saying something about the truck being stuck at the bottom of the trail and needing help getting it unstuck, small specific details that felt uncomfortably real, the kind of thing a stranger or something pretending to be Mike would not necessarily think to invent. I reminded Danny about the rule, keeping my voice low even though I doubted whatever stood outside needed to overhear us to know what we were thinking, and together we lowered ourselves toward the narrow gap beneath the door, the same crack of space the letter described, both of us straining to see anything useful in the dim gray light of early morning. At first all I could make out was a pair of boots standing on the porch boards, worn and muddy, exactly the kind of boots Mike always wore when he came up to the mountains, and for a moment my chest loosened slightly, thinking maybe this really was nothing more than a coincidence, a cousin arriving early to help with the estate. Then my eyes adjusted further, catching the edge of a shadow stretching out from behind those boots, thrown long and thin across the porch floor by the pale light rising over the tree line. And my stomach dropped the instant I realized how far that shadow extended, well past where a normal person's shadow should have stopped, running the entire length of the porch and curling up the wall beside the door frame. Danny saw it at the same moment I did, and I heard him suck in a sharp breath beside me, because the shadow climbing up that wall had no shape where a head should have been, just a smooth curve where the neck met empty space, nothing rising above the shoulders at all. The voice outside called Danny's name a third time, more insistent now, asking why he was taking so long, saying it was freezing out here, and that he really needed help with the truck. And every word sounded exactly right, exactly like something Mike would say, which somehow made the wrongness of that headless shadow even harder to process. Danny pulled back from the door first, moving on instinct more than thought, and gestured toward the corner of the living room where an old axe leaned against the wall near a stack of firewood. The same axe Walt must have kept there for splitting logs, though in this moment it looked like the only thing standing between us and whatever was waiting on the porch. I grabbed it before Danny could, the wooden handle worn smooth from years of use, and I positioned myself a few steps back from the door while Danny backed away toward the kitchen, both of us keeping our eyes fixed on the thin strip of light beneath the door, where that impossible shadow was still visible, unmoving now, like it had realized we were no longer approaching. The knocking started again, harder this time, 3 solid impacts that rattled the door in its frame, followed by a long pause, and then the voice changed entirely, dropping the friendly tone it had been using and settling into something flatter and colder, saying only that it knew we could see it, that hiding inside would not change anything once night came back around. Neither of us answered, and after several seconds of silence, the shadow beneath the door finally began to move, sliding sideways along the porch boards, until it disappeared from the narrow gap entirely, and the sound of boots followed a moment later, slow footsteps moving off the porch and across the dead grass, growing fainter as they retreated toward the tree line. We stayed frozen in place for a long time after the footsteps faded completely, me still gripping the axe with both hands. Danny pressed against the kitchen counter with his phone, clutched so tightly his knuckles had gone white, and it was only when the first real rays of sunlight started cutting through the gaps in the curtains that either of us felt safe enough to lower our guard even slightly. Danny finally spoke, his voice hoarse from hours of whispering, saying that we needed to leave the cabin as soon as it was fully light out, that whatever this place expected from the people who stayed here, he was not willing to find out what happened if we spent a second night under the same roof. I agreed without hesitation, already thinking through the drive back down that narrow mountain road. But something in the back of my mind kept circling around the letters we found from Rosalind, and the way she described the arrangement, the idea that accepting this cabin meant the land expected something in return, and I could not shake the feeling that leaving might not be as simple as just walking out to the truck and driving away before nightfall. By 7 in the morning, the sun had cleared the ridgeline enough to flood the cabin with proper daylight, and the whole place looked almost embarrassingly normal in that light, dust motes drifting through sunbeams, the fireplace sitting cold and ordinary, the bathroom door still bolted shut exactly where we left it. Danny wanted to leave immediately without packing anything beyond the essentials, but I convinced him we should at least grab the lockbox with Walt's documents and the letters from Rosalind, figuring the estate lawyer would need them, and honestly not wanting to leave that stack of warnings behind for the next person who might inherit this place someday. We moved through the cabin quickly, both of us still glancing toward windows and doorways out of habit, though the daylight seemed to have drained whatever confidence the cabin held over us during the night, and for a while it almost felt like we were just 2 guys cleaning up after a bad camping trip instead of survivors of something neither of us fully understood yet. It was when we stepped out onto the porch that the first real problem revealed itself, because the lantern that had been burning steady since 3 in the morning was completely cold now. Not extinguished exactly, more like it had simply used up every drop of oil at once. The glass chimney coated in a thin layer of soot that had not been there the night before. Danny barely glanced at it, already heading toward the Bronco parked at the edge of the clearing, and I followed close behind, both of us moving faster than necessary across the dead grass, neither of us wanting to spend one unnecessary second outside despite the fact that it was broad daylight. The truck sat exactly where we left it, and Danny climbed into the driver's seat, while I circled around to the passenger side, both of us letting out a small breath of relief. When the engine turned over on the first try, a small mercy after everything that had gone wrong since midnight, we made it maybe 200 yards down the gravel drive before Danny slammed on the brakes hard enough to throw me forward against my seatbelt, and when I looked up through the windshield, I saw exactly what had caught his attention. A massive fallen pine blocking the entire width of the narrow road, its root ball torn up from the earth on one side like something had pushed it over rather than let it fall naturally. Danny got out first, walking a slow circle around the fallen tree while I climbed out after him, both of us studying the trunk for any obvious way around it. But the road was narrow enough on both sides that the tree effectively sealed us in. Dense forest pressing close on either side with no clear path for even the Bronco's 4-wheel drive to squeeze past. I asked Danny if there was another road leading off the property, and he shook his head slowly, saying this was the only route in or out that he knew of, the same road we drove up the previous afternoon, and something about the way that fallen tree looked, fresh sap still weeping from the splintered wood, told both of us this had not happened by accident or weather. We spent almost half an hour trying to figure out a solution, first attempting to see if the Bronco could squeeze through a gap near the tree's upturned roots, then discussing whether we should try hiking out on foot and leaving the truck behind entirely. But Danny pointed out it would take hours to walk back to any kind of civilization, hours we would have to spend exposed in the woods with darkness eventually catching up to us again. It was Danny who finally suggested we go back to the cabin and search for tools, remembering a small shed behind the building that we had not bothered to check the day before. And though neither of us said it out loud, I think we both understood that whatever wanted us here was not going to let us leave quite this easily, that the fallen tree felt less like an obstacle and more like a message. The shed turned out to hold exactly what we needed, an old but functional chainsaw hanging on the wall along with a can of gasoline, and Danny spent several minutes checking it over while I stood watch near the shed door, my eyes drifting more than once toward the tree line surrounding the property, half expecting to see something staring back from between the trunks. We hauled the chainsaw back to the fallen pine, and Danny got it running after a few pulls, the noise shattering the unnatural quiet that had settled over the property since we stepped outside. And for the first time since arriving, I felt something like hope. Watching him make steady progress cutting through the trunk, sawdust spraying across the gravel road. It was almost noon by the time we finally cleared enough of the tree to squeeze the Bronco through, both of us exhausted and covered in sawdust, and Danny pulled us forward slowly, easing the truck past the splintered remains of the trunk with only inches to spare on either side. And I remember letting out a shaky laugh of relief once we were fully clear, thinking the worst part of this whole ordeal was finally behind us. That relief lasted exactly until we reached the bend in the road about a mile further down, the same bend that should have opened onto the long, straight stretch leading toward the county highway. Except now, the trees on either side had grown thicker and closer together than either of us remembered from the drive up, the gravel beneath the tires shifting subtly into something closer to packed dirt, and Danny slowed the Bronco to a stop, staring out through the windshield at a road that no longer looked like the one we had driven in on less than 24 hours earlier. Danny tried reversing first, thinking maybe we had simply missed a turn somewhere in the confusion of clearing the fallen tree. But when he glanced in the mirror, the road behind us looked just as unfamiliar, the packed dirt stretching back toward a bend that curved in a direction neither of us remembered passing through. We sat there for a long moment with the engine idling, both of us studying the trees, pressing close on either side, taller and older looking than the ones lining the road on our way up, thick trunks with bark that seemed to absorb the afternoon light instead of reflecting it. Danny pulled out his phone, hoping against hope that we might catch a stray signal now that we were technically further from the cabin. But the screen showed the same empty bars it had shown since we first arrived, and when he checked the map application, it had already loaded the day before. The little blue dot marking our position sat frozen at the exact spot where the fallen tree had blocked the road, refusing to update no matter how long we waited. We decided to keep driving forward, rather than risk getting more turned around by reversing through unfamiliar territory. And Danny eased the Bronco along at a crawl, both of us scanning the tree line for any landmark that might tell us whether we were still heading in the right direction. About 10 minutes later, the road widened slightly into a clearing, and my stomach dropped when I recognized the shape of the cabin sitting ahead of us, the same sagging porch, the same dead grass stretching toward the tree line, and Danny slammed on the brakes so hard the tires kicked up a spray of loose gravel. Neither of us said anything for a while, both of us just staring through the windshield at the cabin we thought we had left behind for good. And I remember feeling something settle in my chest that was heavier than fear, something closer to the exhausted acceptance of a person who finally understands the rules of a game they never agreed to play. Danny put the truck in park and rested his forehead against the steering wheel. And when he finally spoke, his voice sounded hollow, saying that Rosalind's letters made a lot more sense now. That whatever agreement Walt made with this land probably was not something you could simply drive away from once you accepted it. Will or no will, inheritance or no inheritance. I asked him what he thought we were supposed to do now, and he did not answer right away, just sat there staring at the cabin, like it might offer up some kind of explanation on its own. And eventually he said the only thing that made any sense to him, that maybe the letter was never really a warning about surviving one bad night. Maybe it was closer to a set of instructions for living here permanently, for as long as the land decided we belonged to it. We got out of the truck slowly, both of us too drained to argue about alternatives, and made our way back inside the cabin. The afternoon light doing little to make the place feel any safer than it had during the darkest hours of the previous night. Danny went straight for the shoebox of letters, digging through them again with a kind of desperate focus, searching for anything Rosalind might have written about surviving longer than a single cycle of rules. Anything that hinted at an actual way out, rather than just a list of things to avoid doing wrong. Near the very bottom of the stack, tucked between two ordinary-looking letters, we found a single page that neither of us had noticed the first time through. Written in Rosalind's same shaky handwriting, mentioning something she called the release, a specific action that had to be taken exactly at midnight on the third night, involving returning something that had been taken from the land back to the exact spot where it belonged. The letter was frustratingly vague about what that something actually was, only saying that Walt would know it when he found it, that it had been sitting in plain sight in the cabin the entire time they lived there together, hiding among ordinary objects the way important things sometimes do. Danny and I spent the rest of the afternoon searching every corner of the cabin, checking drawers and shelves and the space beneath furniture, both of us increasingly aware of the sun sliding lower toward the tree line with every passing hour, knowing that whatever this third night held in store, we needed to find that object before darkness returned to test us again. It was almost dusk when I finally found it, tucked inside a small wooden box on the top shelf of the bedroom closet. half buried beneath a stack of old sweaters. A single tarnished silver key, far too ornate and old-fashioned to fit any lock we had seen anywhere in the cabin. And the moment my fingers closed around it, I felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees all at once, as if the entire cabin had just noticed exactly what I was holding. Danny took the key from my hand and turned it over slowly under the dim closet light, studying the strange engravings along its handle. Tiny symbols that looked almost like tree branches, twisted into shapes neither of us recognized, and for a moment I thought he was going to ask me to put it back exactly where I found it. Instead, he asked what time it was, and when I checked my own phone, the screen read 6:40. The sun already dipping low enough that long shadows were stretching across the bedroom floor, and I felt that same tightness return to my chest, the one that had not fully gone away since the lantern first went dark. We went back through Rosalind's letters one more time, searching for any detail about where exactly the key needed to be returned, and near the bottom of the page we had already read, in handwriting even shakier than the rest, she had scrawled a location: the base of the largest pine at the edge of the clearing, the one standing directly in line with the front porch. Danny pointed out the obvious problem before I could say it myself, that the letter specifically mentioned the third night, and this was only our second night on the property, which meant either we had to find a way to survive another full cycle of rules before attempting the release, or we had to risk trying it early and hope Rosalind's instructions were more of a guideline than an exact requirement. I did not like either option, but the idea of enduring another full night exactly like the one before felt somehow worse than trying something uncertain. So I told Danny I thought we should at least walk out to that tree while there was still light left, just to see it for ourselves, without actually attempting to use the key until we understood more. We left the cabin together as the last edges of daylight faded behind the ridge, both of us moving quickly across the dead grass toward the largest pine at the edge of the clearing. And up close, the tree looked ancient in a way none of the others around it did, its bark deeply grooved and split in places, roots pushing up through the soil in thick gnarled ridges. At the base of the trunk, half hidden beneath a tangle of exposed roots, we found a small hollow carved into the wood itself, clearly shaped by hand rather than nature, just large enough to fit something the size of the key I was still holding, and Danny and I both stared at it for a long moment, neither of us moving to place the key inside just yet. It was Danny who finally said what we were both thinking, that maybe the third night requirement existed for a reason, that maybe the land needed to see us endure the full pattern before it would accept anything given back early, and reluctantly I agreed, sliding the key into my jacket pocket instead, both of us turning back toward the cabin as the last light disappeared behind the trees. The second night unfolded differently than the first, quieter in some ways and somehow more unsettling in others, the lantern staying lit without any interruption this time, the fireplace never once shifting color, the hallway toward the attic remaining empty and silent. No matter how long either of us stared down its length, we took the silence as its own kind of warning rather than relief, both of us staying awake through every hour marked in the letter, watching the bedroom window without a single knock ever coming, listening at the bathroom door without a single sound from beyond it, and when 6 a.m. finally arrived, no voice called out from the porch at all. No shadow appeared beneath the door. By the time the sun rose fully over the ridge, Danny and I sat exhausted at the kitchen table, both of us unsure whether the quiet had meant we passed some kind of test, or whether it simply meant the land was saving something worse for the night still ahead of us. The third night, the one Rosalind's letter had specifically named. We spent that day differently than the one before, no longer trying to escape, both of us instead preparing as carefully as we could for what was coming, checking every rule one final time, making sure the lantern had enough oil, clearing a straight path from the cabin to the base of that ancient pine in case we needed to move quickly once midnight arrived. When darkness fell for the third time, Everything happened exactly as the letter described, the lantern flickering and holding steady, the fireplace flaring briefly into that same unnatural blue before settling back to normal, the attic stairs creaking once and falling silent. And through it all, Danny and I stayed close together, following every rule without hesitation, counting down the hours toward midnight with the key sitting heavy in my jacket pocket the entire time. At exactly midnight, we stepped out onto the porch, together, the lantern burning steady above us, and crossed the clearing to the base of the pine, both of us moving with the strange calm of people who had already accepted whatever was about to happen. And I knelt down and pressed the key into that hollow carved in the wood, feeling it settle into place with a soft click that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. For a moment, nothing happened at all, and then a low sound rolled through the clearing, not quite wind and not quite a voice, something in between, rising up from the roots of the tree and passing over us like a held breath finally released. And somewhere in that sound I thought I heard Rosalind's name spoken. Once, gently, almost like gratitude. The lantern on the porch went out at that exact moment, but this time neither of us panicked, because the darkness that followed did not feel threatening. It felt final, like a door quietly closing somewhere we could not see. And when Danny and I finally climbed into the Bronco the next morning, the road leading down the mountain looked exactly as it should. Gravel and dirt winding naturally toward the distant highway. No fallen trees, no impossible turns, nothing standing between us and the world we had left behind 3 days earlier. We never spoke much about that weekend after we got back, and Danny sold the cabin to the county not long after settling the estate, refusing every offer from private buyers no matter how much money they put on the table. And sometimes I still wonder about that hollow in the base of the pine tree, whether the key is still sitting there exactly where I left it, waiting patiently for the next person who ever decides to spend a night in that cabin after midnight.